Welcome to Mental Healthy, the podcast where we share stories of the professionals and experts worldwide working in the mental health field. Here's your host, Dr. Kenyon Knapp.
Well, welcome everyone to the Mental Healthy Podcast. I'm glad to have you with us here today. I've got a great guest today, new guest we've never met before, but I've heard great things about you. So welcome to the podcast. This is Shaila Toriy. Glad to have you here today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Why don't you give the listeners a little bit of a background about yourself and where you're from and what brought you here today?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think you'll understand why it's also an interesting answer to give. It's usually, do I answer with a 10-second answer, a 2-minute answer, a 10-minute answer? The reason why is, so I am from Brazil. I'm originally from Brazil, currently located in Brazil. So if you look at the map, I'm right at the tip of the country. So the last state on the south, that's where I'm living right now. Originally from São Paulo, so it's a little bit north of here. Yeah, so that's where I'm from. My parents are also Brazilian, but in terms of my background, my family, so both my brothers and I and my parents, we moved away when I was 5 months old. So we transferred or moved to Holland, and that was in the very early 80s. And my dad was working for a Billy Graham crusade at that time as a translator. And so he lived in Holland for a year, and from then went to the US, and he was doing his master's in the US MDiv. From there, we went to Austria. My parents were called to be global workers missionaries in Eastern Europe. But at that point in time, it was communist, and the main country they were going to serve in was Romania. And it was under the dictatorship of Ceausescu. So late 80s at that point in time. And so Vienna, Austria was where we were based. And that became home for us. We were there for 10 years. And I went to Austrian school for 6 years, learned to read and write German. At home, would speak Portuguese. And then 6th grade onwards, I went to an international school where I had everything in English, and then everything around me, where we lived was German, and at home was Portuguese. So that was kind of our life. And when I was starting high school, we repatriated back to Brazil. My mom was dealing with terminal cancer. So that's what brought us back to Brazil, and finished high school in Brazil, got into psychology, got licensed as a clinical psychologist in Brazil, which would equate to like an MA in clinical counseling in the US. It's a little bit different from the US. And always with that international restless wanting to find my place in the world. And when I got licensed, as soon as I got licensed in Brazil, shortly after, I had a chance to go and serve in China. And I went as a global worker myself, but to work at an outpatient clinic in Shanghai as a clinical psychologist, taking care of or offering therapeutic services to expats, so internationals in Shanghai, working at all kinds of jobs as well as missionaries. So I got exposed to that kind of care, and I fell in love with member care and just the need for that. And also met my husband in Shanghai. So I'm married to a Japanese Brazilian. And so we served together there. He's an engineer. But I served at this outpatient clinic in Shanghai for 5 years in that capacity of psychologist, and just longing to learn more about member care, longing to get more of a biblical training as well, just to understand. My whole training background was secular, and just fantastic training. I loved my university in Brazil, and I'm really grateful for that training. But just wanting to understand a little bit more of an integrative approach, and what could I immerse myself in the world of member care in the US? So we started looking at things in the US that could offer something like that, like an MA, further study, something. And we came across CIU, Columbia International University, that had pastoral care counseling that then merged into care and counseling with emphasis in cross-cultural care. member care, got connected with Dr. Pruitt, Ronnie Pruitt, who was heading up that department then, and was really impacted by her life. And we decided to go to the US. We left our careers in China and moved to Columbia, South Carolina, and got started on that journey, and it was amazing. And we were in the US for close to 4 years. And so I enrolled in the MA in care and counseling with emphasis in cross-cultural care and member care. And I got connected to Curtis for my internship of the MA at CIU. And so I went to intern at then GRC, which is now called Valeo, and we'll talk about that later. But that's a very long explanation. Yeah, please.
No, that's great. I mean, and for the listeners who aren't familiar, Curtis McGowan is his name, and he's the director of Valeo.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, you've got such a neat background. Oh my goodness! I mean, talk about multilingual. You've lived all over the world. I mean, I guess if we want to do a podcast about multiculturalism, you'd be like the perfect guest, right?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to talk about that. Yeah, absolutely. I'm really grateful for my story. I'm really grateful for the opportunities. Lots of challenges along the way. Not an easy trajectory, but a really rich one. And I'm really grateful to have this deep empathy and compassion for the people I serve, because of some similar stories, at least this sense of identity and kind of being a citizen of the world and building a sense of identity based on so many different exposures to different cultures and peoples and worldviews and all that. So it's a great blessing to have that, and I'm really, really blessed and grateful.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you mentioned the organization you work with, Valeo, and some of the listeners will remember about a week or so ago, I had Eric Troyer on the program, who also works at Valeo. But for those of the listeners who don't remember, can you tell the listeners a little bit about, what is Valeo and what do they do?
Yeah, absolutely. So Valeo used to be called GRC, Godspeed Resources Connection. About, 3 years ago, we changed our name and our logo and updated it to better reflect what we do and who we serve. And Valeo, what it means is the name, I am well, effective, and worthy. And it reflects what we long for global workers to experience as they serve the world for a greater good. And we're committed to their success in wellness. So I'm well, and effectiveness, effective, while they live in their reality of worthiness. And our logo, if you ever go to our website, we can post it for you to check it out. Our logo, it's an interesting, so this is
you go.
The logo.
Uh-huh.
And the logo has themes. So messiness, movement, and trajectory. You see the little arrow, and then the thing around it, that's actually a coffee mug, a coffee mug that has a little bit of the coffee underneath, and you place it somewhere, and then that ring stays. So that represents messiness and movement, and then trajectory. And the messiness is to reflect that we live in a world that's very messy. And we don't want to pretend to resolve that messiness, but to be able to be, how can we encourage global workers to stay faithful and content, to find contentment in the midst of that messiness. And then movement, because we believe that we're called to movement in various different ways. Global workers, right? Moving from one culture to another in a perpetual state of transition and movement, culturally, linguistically, adaptation, developing, and all that. So we want them to be able to strive towards movement and growth in different areas of their life, and to know how to ride those waves well, and to help them to continue growing, developing personally, relationally, emotionally, spiritually, and all that. And then the trajectory part of it is, we know that it's very common, and it's part of the journey to get lost along the way, especially when it comes to cross-cultural service, to fall out of alignment, to need realignment. Sometimes we forget our purpose, we question our calling, and all the guilt that comes with that. But we understand that that's part of the journey, and doubting the abilities and calling and all of that, and how life can overshadow so much of the why that maybe was that what they were leaning on that led them to the field in the first place. So we want to help them refresh that why, that direction, to clarify, bring clarity to purpose, and help them align with their calling, with the Lord, with themselves, with others around them. So even the logo carries a lot of significance to what we do. And we serve, so Valeo serves Christian global workers all around the world, those who've been sent to serve cross-culturally, them and their immediate family members. And we serve people literally all over the world, mainly Asia, Europe, South America, Africa, and our home base. So our main office is in Columbia, South Carolina, but we even have providers who are spread around. Most of them are in the US, but we have me in Brazil. We have another one in Asia, Belgium. We had one, Kenya. So we have different providers around the world, and I think that'll be added on over time.
That's great. And I know from some information I read about you that you specialize in trauma work and you work with EMDR, and you've had a lot of training with that. And some of our listeners here in the States are quite familiar with EMDR and others are not. So can you give us a little brief explanation of what EMDR therapy is and maybe how it was developed?
Yeah, absolutely. There are various ways to explain EMDR, and I'll attempt at it, and then I'm happy to clarify, with any further questions. But basically, EMDR it's a significant advancement in the field of trauma work, in the field of psychotherapy. It was developed by a lady called Dr. Francine Shapiro, and she was working this was late 70s, early 80s. I know she published her work in the late 80s, right? But she was working with war veterans, PTSD, studying REM cycles of sleep. And one day she decided to go for a walk, and she was just in the middle of her studies, right? She went for a walk and she was dealing with just thinking of some distressing things. And as she was walking, her eyes were moving bilaterally, and she noticed at the end of that walk just how lessened the vividness of those just the impact of those memories linked to whatever it is that was distressing her at that time. And she just thought, wow, I've been studying the REM cycles of sleep. I'm working with these clients who have PTSD, and I'm noticeably better. I feel a lot better. Could I test this out? So she started testing out. She had a group of people who she then introduced, bilateral stimulation through eye movement. And I'll explain more of that. But she would ask these war veterans to follow her hands with their eyes as they were focusing on a traumatic memory. And another group that was just doing talk therapy, right? And over a course of time, I don't remember the exact time period that they were using it initially, and she noticed the ones that were actually following the movement with their eyes over a certain amount of time experienced a noticeable lessening of the symptoms that they had. So the impact of those traumatic memories was lessened. They were being desensitized to the vividness of those memories. While the other group, who was just using talk therapy, either they were re-traumatizing themselves, heightening the emotions, or no improvement whatsoever. So that was kind of the start of it. And she published her work late 80s, and that introduced a huge approach that has led to so much. And so just another explanation is that, so EMDR therapy from then on, right, Francine Shapiro and others who have worked with her have come up with an 8-phase approach. So it includes history taking, preparation, assessment, desensitization, which is the bilateral that I just mentioned, that could be used with eye movement, but tapping, we'll get into that, other ways to do that. Body scan closure and revaluation. I'll go over those later, but just as an overview, central to the therapy is the use of bilateral stimulation, typically in the form of guided eye movements that I mentioned, even though there are other methods that have been found out later and are used now, widely used. And this bilateral stimulation is believed to mimic that psychological state associated to the REM cycles of sleep. And it facilitates the brain's natural processing capabilities to work through those traumatic memories. And one of the premises of EMDR is that in the same way that our body is wired to heal, to self-heal, as is the brain. And I remember in our training, one of our trainers would say that you're walking down the street, fall down, you scrape your knee, your body will do whatever it can to send the white blood cells to that region of your knee to create that scab, to fight whatever infection, if there is one, to do whatever it can to recover that part of your body. In the same way, your brain is wired to self-heal. So if there is a psychological injury, a trauma, your brain is going to do whatever it can to respond as adaptively, as positively as it can to that traumatic incident, injury. And so our brain is wired to self-heal. And that is one of the premises of EMDR. So a part of the work is for us as EMDR therapists is to help the clients find more adaptive ways to think, to process, and to access those, right? One of the examples I also give to many of my clients is, if you go through a traumatic memory incident, right? You go through an experience that feels traumatic to you. There's a part of your brain, the amygdala, that's going to respond fight, flight, or freeze, right? We've heard of those fight, flight, or freeze responses. So your brain is taking a snapshot of that event, going through that, and saying, okay, danger, danger. So what am I going to do? Am I going to fight? Am I going to flee the situation? Am I going to freeze? And depending on the age you're going through, if it's a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, 15-year-old, 25-year-old, 60-year-old, whatever, your brain is going to respond differently based on how developed your brain is, how developed your language acquisition is, what resources you have, coping mechanisms, support you've had so far, understanding of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the main thing that is true throughout is that your brain, whether you're a 5-year-old or 6-year-old, it's going to do everything it can to protect you from that event, right? So what it does during trauma is that not only does it activate the amygdala to respond in that fight, flight, or freeze response mode, but it isolates you from that neural network. So I go through an experience, I feel things, I hear things, I smell things, I taste things, right? My senses are stimulated and my brain is taking a snapshot, experiencing that, and it's traumatic. So it's uncomfortable, distressing, right? So my brain is going to try to isolate me from that. So it creates an isolated neural network in that experience. So that experience almost gets tucked away in that isolated neural network to protect me, right? So I don't have to relive that over and over again. The problem with that is that, well, let's say, okay, my brain goes that, I survived that incident, I live life as normal. Anything from then on that comes close to my senses, so smells, what I see, what I taste, what I feel, what I hear, if anything comes close to that experience that I've had, it's going to activate the same type of response that I had then. And then I'm confused. I'm just literally taking a walk down the street, but I'm responding as if, there's a bomb exploding right next to me. And I'm feeling extremely anxious, right? My body is activated. And so what EMDR does is identifies that isolated neural network to allow the brain then to find new ways to respond. And our trainer, I know I'm going off on a big explanation, but I think it is relevant as an intro.
Yeah.
Another example I give that I think is helpful is, imagine if you live in a country that is, say, Thailand, right? The norm is high 90, well, maybe even hundreds, 105, 110, normal weather, right? And if you're living there, you don't need clothes, right? You probably wear shorts, tank tops all the time, flip-flops. That's very adaptive. It's a very good response to live in a tropical climate like that. But if you move to Antarctica with those same clothes, that same attire that was very appropriate in Thailand no longer is appropriate in the cold. So that same attire will no longer be adaptive, and it will actually allow you to, experience hypothermia, get extremely sick, and all the other, frostbite, you name it. And so what was appropriate in one climate no longer is appropriate in the other, and you have to find new attire that's appropriate for this new climate. So in the same way, what was appropriate during that traumatic experience no longer is appropriate now once you're out of it. And your brain can find new adaptive ways to cope now that you're an adult, now that you're out of danger, now that you've been exposed to new coping mechanisms. And so that's also a way to conceptualize it that's helpful. So EMDR will help you to find new, more adaptive ways to respond to those traumatic memories.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's pretty clear that you're an expert on EMDR. Yeah, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. That we say EMDR, and I forget that some students may not know what the acronym means.
Yeah, I'm glad you said it. Yes.
This is probably a good time to ask: are there any resources or books or websites, things like that might be helpful? It's like if one of the listeners right now is going, "Oh, this is so cool! I want to learn more about that."
Yes.
Where should they go?
Yes, that's a great question. So the EMDRIA, it's kind of like the governing board of EMDR. So www.emdria.org. That's the official website of the EMDR International Association. They have a lot of information. What is EMDR? Why EMDR? Latest articles, research, even a directory of EMDR therapists that you can get in touch with. It's a great, just even trainings, further trainings, advanced basic workshops, advanced workshops, really great stuff on that website. I encourage you guys to be a part of that. And then the EMDR Institute, which is the one that was founded by Dr. Shapiro, who created the EMDR therapy, right? And there's a lot of information there as well. Also latest research, just talk about EMDR in general, and also a directory of therapists, so you could find people there. And then there's the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, not exclusively, so it's more trauma work, right? But it includes EMDR, and just also a very valuable resource for information there, including EMDR. And then the ADAA, which is Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Also, there's a broad range of information on anxiety, depression, all kinds of disorders there, including EMDR, and how the effectiveness of EMDR for those conditions, right? And then books, there's a lot out there, but I just chose 3 here that are, many of you may have even read those as you've gone through graduate school, but it's always great to go back to them. So Getting Past Your Past, Take Control of Your Life with Self-Help Techniques from EMDR Therapy by Francine Shapiro. So this is by the lady who created it. And it's user-friendly. There's a lot of insight in that book. It's something you can always come back to. And then the second one is EMDR, the Breakthrough Therapy for Overcoming Anxiety, Stress, and Trauma. Also by Francine Shapiro, but there's another author who helped her, Marco Silk Forest. More of an overview on EMDR therapy, how it developed and how it's applied to different things, psychological issues. And then one that we've heard across the board, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Really, really good book. Really great book. I love this one. Also not really exclusively. Popular. Yeah, it is. It's not exclusively about EMDR, but includes EMDR, and he's a trauma expert. So yeah, those are great books. There's a lot out there. I mean, even if you just go to the emdria.org, they have a list of books and just articles and things. And the great thing there is that you're staying up to date to all the new research that's coming out, about EMDR, its effectiveness, and all of that. So there's a lot out there.
That's great. Well, thanks for sharing those resources. Now, a minute ago, you started to share about the 8 phases of EMDR.
Oh,
Can you
yeah.
talk a little bit about that, just to sort of lay out, like, what's the game plan of how you do this kind of therapy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so EMDR is seen as an 8-phase treatment approach, and just designed to help all aspects of a traumatic memory that a client has. And so the first phase would be history taking and treatment planning. So this is the initial phase where the therapist will assess the client's history, just identify which traumatic memories are there that we want to target in therapy. And this phase is very important because it sets the groundwork for the treatment plan, and it will focus on past memories, current triggers, and future goals. At the 3-pronged approach that EMDR talks about. So past, present, and future. And depending on the client, we might go into this, but depending on the client's state, their current coping mechanisms, how they know how they emotionally regulate, whether their window of tolerance, all of that will determine whether we go into the past, stay present, focus more on future. So that's also it's very important for us today to do this initial phase to identify, okay, is this a client whose past is not, let's not focus on the past right now. We're just going to stay with present triggers. The second one is preparation. So this is where the therapist will introduce EMDR. What is it, right? Kind of some of the explanations I gave here that I use with my clients, explaining the process, explaining its effects, introducing here as well techniques to reduce the stress. Teaching them, how can you emotionally regulate? We're going to teach them that in this phase. We're going to prepare the client to process traumatic memories. And there are 2 main grounding exercises here, even that we use. The container, some of you guys may know. Container, peaceful place. Peaceful place we hear about in a lot of different approaches, like psychotherapeutic approaches, but with EMDR, we just combine the bilateral stimulation for this to enhance the grounding effects of this exercise. And that would be a way to teach emotional regulation to the clients, because once you target, the third step would be assessment, where you're going to select a specific memory to target with your client, and the client will identify the visual image, related to the memory, what represents. So what image comes to your mind when you think about this event, right? What is the worst part of it, or what is an image that represents it? What is the belief? So what were you thinking? Basically, what were you believing during that traumatic incident? What were you feeling? What were you feeling in your body? So body sensations. And then to think through, okay, what do I want to be able to believe? So if I'm thinking of a situation where I felt totally trapped, out of options, I'm overcome with fear, but I feel trapped. I want to be able to think of that memory, but believe that I have other options. Or, you know what? I survived this. I'm a survivor. I survived this. I'm no longer there. But you're going to think of a more adaptive belief to re-script to. So what we're going to do is we're going to enter that memory that we targeted. So client chose that memory with a therapist. We agreed on it. We identified, the fear that I felt. This is how my body responded in the moment. This is my negative core, the belief, the maladaptive belief that I had in that moment. So once I've identified that, I go through a phase of desensitization, right, of the body, checking the validity of that belief. So maybe I enter into the memory. So when we target the memory and we start processing through bilateral stimulation, that belief may feel extremely true, very, very true. And I can't even contemplate believing anything else. But through bilateral stimulation, through that processing phase, we're going to bring the desensitization into the process, right? desensitize the body of the client to the memory, and decrease the validity of that maladaptive belief. So once I've decreased the validity of that maladaptive belief, that's when I want to rescript. I want to allow the brain to say, oh, I have an option to believe something else when I think of this memory. That's what we say when we say, what belief do I want to believe, right? We're not going to introduce that until the client is desensitized and has brought down the validity. So it might sound very conceptual right now. It did to me when I was first trained, but when you experience it, it's pretty amazing because it works. So anyway, I kind of went into the desensitization phase, which is the 4, which I talked about bilateral stimulation, eye movement. I do EMDR online, so I use bilateral like eye movement, but the one that I use the most is actually tapping. So I usually tap with my clients, and they, for the most part, they like this. Those who don't enjoy this, they'll do tapping on their knees or tapping on the floor with their feet. So all of those will accomplish the same thing. Yeah, so then we guide the client through that. And then the 5th phase is the installation. And this is when we strengthen that adaptive belief that we talked about. So maladaptive belief has gone down. I'm desensitized to the memory. I've pre-established so that the adaptive belief I've talked about before even starting to process. So now, let's say from 0 to 10, if I was distressed at a level of 8 out of 10, now I'm at a 1. And let's say my maladaptive belief that I was trapped was a 6 out of 7. Now it's down to a 2 or to a 1. And now I bring in the adaptive belief. So what I want to believe that I have other options, right? Or I have a way out. So now I start the bilateral stimulation, the processing, focusing on the memory, holding this new, more adaptive belief. And installation that I was talking about is to strengthen that new adaptive belief, holding the memory, the target memory, with the new adaptive belief until it feels true. And so in the beginning, it might feel like, oh, it's a 1 out of 7. I don't really believe it. And we just hold on to it as you target the memory and as you use bilateral stimulation until we start bringing it up to feel more true. And so bilateral stimulation is used to enhance this process. And then 6 would be body scan. So the client is asked to think of the target memory and then to notice, is there any residual bodily tension or discomfort here as they think of that memory? And the bilateral stimulation is used to process those remaining residual sensations until the client can think of the memory without any noticeable negative physical reactions. That would be the body scan. And then finally closure. And this will ensure that the client will leave the session feeling a lot better than the client was in the beginning of the session. And which is very common, if processing the target memory, we've targeted the memory, we've processed it, but we only have 20 minutes left of our session, or 10 minutes left. It's very common not to complete a full memory in one session. So that's where the grounding techniques come in, to almost put it on hold, to either put it in the container or use the peaceful place until we're ready to readdress it, until we're ready to process them. So techniques are used to help the client just regain control and self-regulate, and to be then reassessed next time, right? And the last phase, which is reevaluation. So at the beginning of the subsequent sessions, the therapist will check on the client's progress to make sure, okay, did any positive effects remain? Was there any flooding during the week? Like, we want to make sure that doesn't happen, or at least try our best to equip the client for that not to happen. And to determine, okay, can we re-enter that target memory? Is the client okay to do that right now? Or no, you know what? We fully targeted that memory X. Client is ready to move to a new target memory. So those are the 8 phases. Very important, kind of crucial to the effectiveness of EMDR.
Yeah, Well, thanks for describing those. That really lays it all out in the process. What jumps out at me is I know here at Liberty, there's a lot of people who are really appreciate the belief systems of clients and try to really be sensitive to that and all, especially spiritual beliefs and all that. But I guess when you talk about helping people change their beliefs to more adaptive beliefs and things like that, since we're talking about trauma, would I be correct in assuming that when you say more adaptive beliefs, we're talking about like if a person has a trauma and then they believe, oh, I'm a horrible person or something, the beliefs you're trying to change, are they often beliefs that they develop because of a trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, absolutely. Well, shame being a very common state that a trauma
Uh-huh.
survivor lives in, right?
Uh-huh.
So I undergo an experience, I feel guilty about it, very common, right? Even though I'm the victim. The problem is I am what I went through, right? I'm not guilty. I am that. I am the
Uh-huh.
horrible thing that happened to me, and therefore I'm not worthy. So directly linked to the trauma. And the with the adaptive beliefs, with I think EMDR, there's so much already work that's done for us, right?
Yeah.
So with what I use, for example, instead of like, oh, what could be a positive thing for the person to think, there's like a cheat sheet we go to, those basic, what do people need to believe? That they're loved, that they're accepted, that they're
Mm.
seen, that they're worthy. So those basic core beliefs that we hear about, even outside of EMDR, every psychotherapeutic approach will touch on it at some point in some way, right? So we always come back to those with trauma, always. It's not, they're not so different. It's really interesting because you'll
Mm.
work through trauma over and over again, and it always comes back to these main common things, which makes sense, right? If a child has been abused, what are their conclusions going to be from that experience? It's not that they're worthy,
Yeah.
it's not that they're loved, right? It's quite the opposite of that. So we end up falling into it's just this very common negative belief scope. And so in that same way, so here, I have an example here. Like, I'm inadequate, very common thing to believe, right? I'm inadequate. So the
Uh-huh.
positive or the more adaptive belief pairing would be, I'm okay as I am.
Mm.
Essentially, I'm good enough, right? As I am. Or I'm worthless, unlovable. I have value and self-worth regardless. Um, I'm incompetent. I'm capable, competent enough regardless. I'm a failure. I can learn from my experiences, right? I'm unimportant. I have value and self worth and can get my needs met regardless. I have to be perfect. I can accept my strengths and weaknesses and be okay regardless. So there's a lot more than that. But does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah. It really does. Let me go a different angle here with you. Let's just say there's some student listening who goes, yeah, I've heard that this has got some research that says it works or whatever, but this sounds like all the quacky stuff I've heard about, psychology and psychobabble. And you sit here going like this with your hands, you go tap, 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 and all of a sudden everything's better because you go tap, tap. Like if somebody's listening and they're really like skeptical and this sounds like a bunch of hooey, what would you say to a skeptical person who might be thinking that?
Yeah. And that's not uncommon,
Yeah.
really. I mean, a lot of my clients here, I'm like, you know what? There's this approach. And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. And they already, they take a few steps back, virtually even. Um,
Yeah.
so I think addressing skepticism when we're working with EMDR is necessary and crucial. Um, every EMDR therapist needs to be ready to do that and to address it effectively, and with grace, right? Understanding that when I was trained, I had heard of EMDR. I went in with it with my, few thoughts of my own. Does this really work? Is this really as effective? So I think the first thing is research helps. So the more you understand that there is research, that there is a process to how EMDR was developed, how it works, it does help to demystify some of that process and to reduce the fear. It is evidence-based, and there's always new research coming out, right? So I think that helps. I always direct people to, hey, read about it. Go onto the website of EMDR, read as many things as you want. I'm happy to discuss it with you. That really helps. So sharing research stories, success stories, I often use that too. Like I'll give clients a few examples of general, right, without giving away anything, just still being confidential, but giving examples of, yeah, people who were struggling with phobias or, you know, non-functional people coming in because they were survivors of trauma, complex PTSD, all kinds of things, and just their journey of freedom, you know, and how much they've grown. And yeah, it really works. And so that also helps them hearing research, hearing success stories. Therapeutic Alliance helps, right? If you're working, obviously, if it's a student and you're the professor, I mean, to be gracious, patient, allow them to express their fears and all that, but to share all that. But if it's a client, to build that therapeutic alliance is crucial and foundational, to allow the student or the client to feel heard, validated, respected, right? That will help as well. Also validating concerns, right? Hey,
Yeah, definitely.
many of us have been there, and it's a natural response to have. It is strange. It's not something we naturally do. Especially for those, I think, especially for those who've had negative experiences in therapy, right? We come across a lot of people who have had, yeah, just negative experience, and which is a bummer, but that's kind of part, right, of the reality of the world we live in. And maybe encouraging them to try something new and to start gradual. I think with clients, I always start with something very simple. You know, I'm not going to start with the biggest, baddest thing. I'm going to use imagery that they know that is, you know, calming, and you test it out. You know, I have had clients who said, this is too much for me. It's okay. You respect their pace, their timing, and you offer the space that they need. And if they're ever open to it, great. Encourage them in that way. If they're not, you respect them as well in that regard. Yeah, so starting slowly is really important. So what I had said, sharing what I had said before about the grounding techniques, for me, in my experience working with EMDR, when I teach my clients grounding techniques, that's when they get sold on EMDR, right? That's where they're like, oh, this actually works. And we're not even targeting big, bad things, nothing, right? We're just doing grounding. And that's when and it's very simple. It's concepts that they can follow and they can walk with. So that's where, starting slow, that's where they're like, oh, yes, I want more of this, because their body responds. So I think that's also helpful. Yeah. And obviously, depending on the client that comes in, control exposure, right? Take it easy.
Yeah.
You're not going to start with the worst thing. It has to be a very non-threatening process. And another thing that might be helpful to emphasize is, again, if a student, right, but for a client in session, one of the things that we want to emphasize is autonomy and empowerment. So we're going to target these memories, or we're going to even do grounding, and we're going to do bilateral, but you have control. We can stop at any point in time. I'll lead you here with the pacing and all that, the sets that we're going to do of tapping. But you can stop at any point in time, and we can just do breathing, we can talk. So to give that sense of empowerment and autonomy is also very important.
Well, let me ask you this too. Like, I know this is a neat therapy, but you know, not every one therapy works for every client. So, as we're wrapping up here, let me ask you, I know there's probably some challenges, limitations, or benefits of this approach as compared to cognitive behavior therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy or other forms of therapy. What would you say are some of those challenges, limitations, and benefits?
I'll touch on it.
Yeah.
So skepticism, you already touched on one of them, right? resistance and
Uh-huh.
skepticism. Complex trauma and dissociation. So in terms of challenges, so people who have dissociative disorders, complex PTSD, presenting dissociative symptoms. So that can present a challenge. And I think with the therapist, these clients are going to require more extensive preparation, stabilization before they actually enter into processing phases, which would be the bilateral. So just we call it the resourcing phase. Just what adaptive neural networks do you have present in your life right now? Are there any beliefs that you hold today that are true, are working for you, help you grow? So we're gonna focus on that first before we enter into anything that's negative and heavy and all right, it's gonna bring you down, especially if you have the tendency to dissociate, right? And I've gone through that in therapy. Like you pretty quickly you notice if a client is gonna dissociate. So that is definitely a challenge. Then managing emotional overwhelm. Some clients, not even necessarily to dissociate to that point, but they may experience intense emotional and physical reactions during the processing phases. That's quite common, right? So that is a challenge, and we don't want them to re-traumatize. And that is something to always be aware of and to prepare the client for. And I think that's why the grounding is so important, so that the client knows that before they get out of their window of tolerance, we can desensitize them. We can go into a grounding technique to bring them down. It is a challenge. Yeah, another challenge, client retention. Sometimes due to the intensity of therapy, the clients may drop out before they're completing like the full EMDR protocol, right? And that's challenging, especially when you're dealing with a deeply traumatic event. I haven't had many of those, but I've had maybe a couple of people kind of drop off because they can't sustain. But I think that the therapist has to foresee that and prepare the client to the best of their ability, right? To the therapist's ability.
Let me ask you about that real quick. To do the 8-phase protocol, is there a typical length of sessions? Is it like 8 sessions that you normally do, or is it 12, or is there any normal length of time per se?
That's a great question. When you find out, you tell me, because in my experience, if a person is coming in with complex PTSD, it's going to take longer, much longer than that. I would even say up to a year easily, depending on, because if it depends on what do they have working for them. Do they have established coping mechanisms? How aware are they of their own functioning? How willing are they to enter in? What is their window of tolerance? I mean, there's so many things that go into it to even prepare the client to enter in. Once they're prepared and ready, to enter in, that phase, man, that's wonderful. That's great. We're going to see a lot of results in that space. But there's a lot of prep work that goes into it beforehand. And then once you enter in, how will they respond, right? But again, if they're well prepped, the result, it is great. It's wonderful to enter in with them, to be able to process and to have clients say, wow, within even a session, to have them enter into the session saying, I feel like I'm at an 8 out of 10 based on this experience that I went through. And by the end of the session, they're at a 2. One session. But that's not all encompassing, right? Because then you have to reevaluate, strengthen, and you're dealing with one neural network that has multiple experiences, right? If you deal with, if you deal with a touchstone event, which is what, let's say I was a 5-year-old and went through an experience X, and that introduced a maladaptive belief. And then I have 15 other experiences, example, that enhance that belief. If I go to the touchstone event, which is that first event as a 5-year-old, and I rescript that, that's going to impact all the other ones in that same neural network. But not everybody wants to go to the touchstone event. Not everybody's ready to do that and have the coping mechanisms are ready to do that. And that's okay. So that'll impact the duration of the therapy as well. I do have people coming in and they're there for really, I have had clients who come in for a very specific thing. They're very well prepped. They've done therapy before. They're functional people, but they're coming in to target this one event. We do maybe 3 or 4 sessions and then they go on their way and I'll see them again 6 months time or a year just to target this one other event for 3 to 5 sessions and then they go on their way. But that's the exception. I would say that's the exception. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, it really does. You've given a great overview of EMDR and the phases of it and some of the limitations and all that. And I tell you what, if the listener is hearing all this going, this is so cool, I really like this, I want to learn more about it. How would you recommend that people learn more about you and the work you do, or maybe about Valeo that you talked about at the beginning? Or if they wanted to get in touch with you, how would you like people to do that?
Go to our website. So valeo.global. I think there's a little item that says meet the team or something like that. I'm trying to remember what it says. Team. It just says team. And then you can learn more about our team, not just me. I'm not the only EMDR therapist at Valeo, but if you want to learn more about me, I'm there. And you can email me at shaila@valeo.global. You can email me directly as well, and I'm happy to direct you if I can help you. I'll be happy to be able to help you in that way. Yeah, and then go on our website. There's even free resources there. So even if you go to our website, the opening page on our website, if you scroll all the way down, we have some free resources there about stress. There's a field guide with very helpful sections about the outcomes that we want to see. I'll even share this in global workers. So this is our field guide, global worker field guide. I don't know if Eric may have shared this, but it has different sections. So, and this is like resources that you could use for yourself, for a small group, therapeutic resource. It talks about your story, like just processing through your own story, timeline, and all that, healing. And our director Curtis, he talks about shalofring. At some point, we'll have to talk about it. Shalom and suffering. You know, we're called to suffer, but to experience shalom while suffering. And so that will be touched on in struggling well. That's one of the items. Struggling well. What does that mean? Processing your struggles, understanding what it is, and then alignment. There's one of that, and then equipping. It's free. It's on our website. Great resource to come by. Yeah, and if you have any further questions, obviously you can just email me. Be happy to talk.
Well, free is always good. I know our listeners are like that. And
yeah,
so
absolutely.
Just a reminder, everyone, the website is valeo.global, so valeo.global, and you can check out Shaila's work there. Now, before we wrap up, though, I always try to ask everyone just a catch-all question at the end here. Is there anything else on your heart or mind that you wanted to share with the listeners today before we wrap it up?
Well, since I am an EMDR therapist and wanting to, if you haven't yet experienced EMDR therapy, I encourage you to do that. And even if you're not going to do it for a long time, but just to have the experience of it, because it is life-changing. And I really believe it's a resource the Lord has given us. It's a blessing, and it's such a testament to us being the creation of an incredible creator, and how our mind and our body is wired towards healing. And it's just one of those things that I really believe that God has created for us to experience more of him. And I'll just say this, the coolest thing about being an EMDR therapist with people who know Jesus is seeing them to get experiencing him in session, where I just get to sit back and see what the Lord is doing and them experiencing him in session. And that is absolutely amazing and such a gift. And I'm so blessed. Yeah. I get to selfishly be extremely blessed by seeing them get healed. It's really cool. And to see the Lord just impacting them and speaking to them. And EMDR, I really believe it's a platform that God has given us. So if you haven't had a chance yet, I strongly encourage you to consider it. I think it'll be a blessing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for being on the podcast today, Shaila. I really appreciate you joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. This is Shaila Toriy, and she's with Valeo.global. So I encourage you to check her out and all the neat work she does. And thank you, listeners, for joining us today on the Mental Healthy Podcast. I appreciate it, and we'll be with you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Mental Healthy. If you want to hear more episodes, please hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts and head to linktree.com/mentalhealthypodcast for all of our social media platforms with the latest mental healthy content. If you have a story to share that relates to what we discussed in this episode or any other episode, please contact us at mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. That's mentalhealthy2020@gmail.com. Thank you, and God bless.